morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Monday, November 17th. I'm joined by our senior producer at 11 Warriors, Chase Brown, coming off of yet another win for Ohio State this past weekend over UCLA by a 48-10 final score. Chase, how was your weekend? Did you enjoy the Ohio State game?
It was good. Yeah, no, it was good. We were just talking off air to peel back the curtain a little bit about late nights and covering sports. And it's always one of those things that gets behind you pretty quickly, catches up on you pretty quickly, I guess, where you're like, oh, it's a night game, this will be really fun, and then you end up going to bed way later than you usually do, try to find your rhythm then on Sunday, maybe have that kind of leak over into the week. So I feel like I'm catching up a little bit today, but definitely was a game that was worth remembering in some respects and worth forgetting in some others. I think that most Ohio State fans maybe had that kind of experience, and a 48-10 win that, if you ask me about it 5 years from now, I'm not sure I'll be able to tell you what happened or who played well or whatever, but certainly going to be lots to talk about on today's show, at least.
Yeah, I did last year. I did the first Oregon game, which was extremely late. And then I did the Texas, the college football playoff semifinal, and that one, there was so much going on that I said, okay, I still have an article I need to write, but I'm going to take a self-imposed 2 hour nap at 3:30 and then get up at 5:30 and finish my writing and then go back to bed. So it's
Was that like a good game? Did somebody have like a game-winning play in that
well, the
game?
funny thing about that, I mentioned it on this show before, was that I like the bounce that happened when Sawyer did the strip sack. I could tell based on the trajectory of the ball that he was going to be able to pick it up and run unimpeded.
Yeah.
And so I saw the play happening before it really even took place. And my immediate thought wasn't, oh my gosh, this is one of the greatest defensive plays in Ohio State football history. It was, I'm going to have to write a lot of stuff about this tonight, and I'm probably going to be up pretty late. This is what this business does to you. You can't even enjoy these things as a fan anymore. But it's a labor of love, certainly for both of us. But not to harp too much on past accomplishments for this program or ourselves, we will get into the most recent win for Ohio State in a moment. But before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They're locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Now, Chase, you and Dan and I made this point on the show last week in previewing the UCLA game. We wanted to go against the grain, so to speak, about a month ago. And when I asked the question to our own staff and the 11 Warriors audience at large after the Illinois game, I think it was back in October, other than Michigan, which opponent remaining on Ohio State's regular season schedule most concerns you, who would it be? Pretty much everybody was defaulting to Penn State in spite of the fact that they were in free fall and about to fire James Franklin. We wanted to be cute, and because UCLA was coming off of uh, beginning the process of Franklin's transition out of Happy Valley, we all said UCLA because we thought, oh, with Nico Iamaleava's trending up, it's a revenge game for him, and UCLA, they're starting to have a bit of a bounce back, and that momentum slowed to a crawl within the last few weeks, and then there were some interesting storylines that started to take shape relative to player availability prior to this game. One of them was that Nico Iamaleava was going to be out with a concussion, and his backup basically had no game experience, and there really wasn't a lot of film available for him. That would be one Luke Duncan, who, all things considered, if you look at the final stat line, didn't really even necessarily play poorly, but was certainly outmatched and was there's more encouraging environments I think you would want to make your first start or appearance in college football than Columbus on a Saturday night against the number one team in the country and a historically great defense. In addition to that, last week we had the Carnell Tate absence. That continued into this week. He's definitely managing some kind of nagging injury that they don't want to go into too many specifics on. But it seems like if they were in dire circumstances, he would be able to play. Games in which you were favored by 30 points don't seem to be fitting the bill for that, and so he is sat out. Uh, there were there was a lot of concern around Jeremiah Smith. Um, Even like before, during, and after the game, frankly. I was surprised, honestly, that he did play given the circumstances. I think that if we had an inclination that he was uh, visibly compromised going into this game, in addition that Tate was going to miss a second straight game, that our scoring predictions all probably would have looked a little different. That being said, Ohio State still took care of business relative to public expectations. They were up 27-0 at halftime. Probably could have been even more if they had been able to do something with the turnover towards the end of the half that ended up netting only a field goal. We got our first kick return touchdown for Ohio State in about 15 years, courtesy of Lorenzo Styles Jr. and fortunate screen, if you want to call it, from one of the officials. But that being said, I don't know how many takeaways you can really have from this game relative to the bizarre circumstances that were around it. I figured Ohio State was going to be up as much as they were at halftime, but it would be largely the product of Sayin. They didn't really lean on Sayin as much this game as they did the ground game, but UCLA didn't project to have a necessarily formidable run defense going into this game. So I'm just curious what takeaways you have, if any, from this one relative to these last two games that we have coming up on the regular season schedule. More specifically, if you do want to get into this, uh, a lot of people were looking this as especially coming out of a letdown in the Purdue game relative to the ground game. People were hoping things were tuned up a little bit in that department. Did you come away feeling more encouraged by that? Or did you think, given the quality of opponent, that there's still some questions that need to be answered?
Yeah, to address that one first, I think it's hard to judge exactly how well Ohio State performed on the ground against UCLA, considering it came in to the game ranked outside the top 100 in the FBS against the run. So I think you only would have been concerned if Ohio State didn't have success on the ground. It did, and that is a result, I think, of both the way that Ohio State performed, but probably more so UCLA's inability to stop the ground game of any of the opponents that they've played this season, let alone the calibers of the Indianas and the Ohio States that they've played this year. As far as primary takeaways, I would say that this was a game Ohio State just wanted to get in and get out of. You really kind of winced a little bit when you see Julian Sayin tweak his looked like maybe his left foot when he came down. He landed a little bit weird, a little bit awkwardly on it. You wince a
Yeah, that
little
was
bit at
another
that.
injury storyline I didn't even get
Mm,
into. So
exactly.
this game was full of them.
It was, and you're just hoping, okay, let's just get out of here. At some point, the decision has to be made by Ohio State's coaches to, okay, we're down Carnell Tate. Jeremiah Smith has a nagging injury or nagging issue, as Ryan Day called it after the game, and Julian Sand is a little bit banged up. And those are your top three guys, not only on offense, but really three of your top guys on the entire team, along with Arvell Reese and Caleb Downs and Sonny Styles this season. And so I think that Ohio State, eh, for the performance that it had relative to the talent it had on the field offensively, I think had a great day. I do think that it was encouraging to see Brandon Inniss step forward and have a career high 6 catches in this game. I would have liked to see Ohio State's receivers behind Inniss generate a little bit more separation. I thought that Bryson Rogers and Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham have some stuff to work on this week when they go and watch the film of this game. Because Ohio State's going to need those guys. Jeremiah Smith and Carnell are great, but they are coming back from these injuries, and you just don't know how their bodies are going to continue to react as they try to heal and they try to get themselves ready for that important game on November 29th against the Michigan team who, I know we won't get into it on today's episode, but they escape with a win over Northwestern at Wrigley Field. It seems like that game is going to be about Ohio State not beating Ohio State. And so you don't want there to be any doubt about whether or not Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate can contribute, as you want to keep those guys healthy. In the meantime, you want to be able to see some of the guys behind them have some encouraging signs of growth. So I think that there's still room there for those guys to do that this upcoming weekend against Rutgers. And then the defense just looks, as it has all season. I'm sure that they would have loved to have faced a quarterback the caliber that Nico is, especially as a dual threat option. With you having Bryce Underwood on the schedule a couple of weeks from now, to have his ability, his toughness, his just overall impact on the game, it's very clear that UCLA missed that on Saturday. So I think that Ohio State probably, if you gave each of the coaches and the players some truth serum, that they would say we wanted to face him in this game. I do think that there was some things that they can take away, hopefully, for the game plans against Rutgers and Michigan in the final 2 weeks.
So another interesting thing that happened in this game that wasn't related to injuries was probably the best game that James Peoples has had this season. He hadn't scored prior to this game. He had 2 touchdowns in this game. One of them might have been the best highlight that any running back on the team has had this season, period. It's and again, you have to take it with a grain of salt given the quality of run defense that you alluded to off the top. But I listen, most of the time that you see a guy get hurdled in the open field, it's just a spectacle on its own face. It's not ending with points. This was a case in which James Peoples literally hurdled a guy in the process of scoring a touchdown, which makes it probably the best highlight that any running back on the team has had this year. That being said, Isaiah West still finished with 8 carries for 61 yards and a score on his own, and has still kind of continued to settle more into the RB2 role on this team, while Bo Jackson, at this point, we're all pretty convinced is clearly the number one back. So uh, up to today's game, it seemed like Isaiah West was trending towards being the RB2, but Peoples finally got himself off the mat, so to speak, relative to a season that's been full of letdowns. The funny thing about the highlight that he had was that when Bo Jackson started to take over the lead position he had occupied at the beginning of the season, one of the areas in which a lot of people cited their disappointment with Peoples was that he just didn't seem as explosive as Jackson did. Well, I don't think a player that's capable of hurdling other defenders in the open field is a non-explosive football player, so to speak. So I think that maybe Peoples was dealing with some sort of unspoken injury in the beginning of the season. I would still think that in terms of just big playability, Jackson has clearly proven more in terms of, I guess, longer touchdown scoring ability, because the one that Peoples had, I think, was still from within the red zone. I think it was like a 19-yard touchdown. But that being said, this is my long-winded way of asking you, who would you be more interested in locking down the running back 2 role going forward? Because at this point, we didn't even see CJ Donaldson take any snaps in this game, even though he had kind of been the short down goal line de facto running back. But we've seen Isaiah West now put together a string of solid games behind Bo Jackson. But we're also seeing Peoples just had his best game of the season. Are you coming away from this thinking that Peoples deserves another shot at regaining some of the ground that he lost, or would you rather see them commit to Isaiah West behind Bo Jackson going forward?
I think that James Peoples, with his performance against UCLA, definitely earned some more opportunities. I think given the hurdle, that's going to be the moment that people remember. But a second before that hurdle, he made a UCLA's defender. He made him fall on the ground. Like, it was honestly very impressive. He had a cut that went inside. He bounced it back outside to then hurdle and get into the end zone. And that was something that Ryan Day has talked about has been lacking in Ohio State's run game until maybe a couple of weeks ago when Isaiah West kind of entered into the fold and started making people miss. I was very encouraged by the way that James Peoples was talking after the game, just about his own personal performance this season. And I think that he's experienced a lot of maturity and a lot of growth this year, where he I don't know if he necessarily assumed that he was going to be the guy in Ohio State's running back room, but I think that everyone probably made that assumption considering he was Ohio State's number 3 running back behind Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins last year. So the natural transition is for him to be the guy alongside CJ Donaldson, who they bring in as a transfer from West Virginia. And that's kind of how it started this season. But then it became hard to deny Bo Jackson's ability and his impact on the game. And Ohio State, I think smartly, was bringing him along well. And now you're seeing that he is going to be, I would assume, the unquestioned running back down the stretch that's going to take the majority of the carries in the game. But Isaiah West and and James Peoples are two running backs that I want to see more of, especially on Saturday. I'm not saying that that will be necessarily a tryout or a competition that then determines who's going to be the second running back for Ohio State against Michigan or in the college football playoff or even in the Big Ten championship game. But I do think that you're seeing James Peoples, since the Penn State game, really play with a confidence that you maybe expected he would come into the season with. And so it's taken some time, but I think he is now practicing hard. He is playing hard. And I think that he's earning opportunities for Ohio State's offense that maybe you will see him become a more consistent contributor for the Buckeyes down the stretch.
Yeah, I will say that whatever expectations we have for next week against Rutgers, even though obviously we all Greg Schiano is very near and dear to our hearts for the contributions he made to Ohio State's defense when he was in the fold with the Scarlet and Gray. Rutgers, even though you would assume that they would have a rep for having a sturdy defense under Schiano, they've actually quietly been one of the worst teams defensively in college football this year. So it's hardly like there's much of a level up in competition in terms of formidable run defense from UCLA to what they're going to experience next week. And that once they it's going to be a pretty big jump in terms of resistance once they go into the Michigan game. So unfortunately, the opponent that they still have to get off their back relative to just the idea of getting the monkey off your back is still going to be the one that we kind of find out the truth about where this running game rests as we prepare to watch Ohio State in the postseason. But they do have one more opportunity to roll the backs out there and get the offensive line their ducks in a row and see just how they fare. I came away relatively encouraged. I mean, I would have liked to see Sayan light it up, but again, given the weird injuries surrounding not only the receivers pregame, but then also what happened over the course of the game with him and his ankle, it was good that they leaned on the running game the way that they did, and they were still able to handle business against an opponent that was expected to be far inferior. So if they fulfill that standard again next week, I think I'll be at peace with it going into Michigan. And then when the Michigan game rolls around, we'll find out how are they really going to fare against an opponent that's going to be able to give them some resistance once they start playing the better teams of what we've seen of late.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And I do think one more point I'll make on Julian Sayin is I would, to maybe go back and correct myself a little bit, I do think that Ohio State's wide receivers behind Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate are talented, but they're not Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, and few receivers are. And I do think that some of Julian Sayin's struggles in this game kind of came when he was making throws as if he were throwing to those two guys. That's how much separation Brandon Inniss and Bryson Rogers and Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham, those guys were creating, that when you're making those throws, those are ones that Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith have made all season. Those are maybe not catches that group of 4 receivers make on a regular basis.
And when we're talking about struggles relative to Julian Sayin, we're talking about the first time all year he's thrown 3 incompletions in a row.
Yeah, and it's like 75% completion percentage, no turnovers. It's like, struggle is certainly something to laugh at there in comparison to his performances earlier this year. So, I do think, as you're mentioning with Rutgers, it might just be another game. Can we just get in and get out? I don't know. Dan Hope made the joke earlier this weekend about, can we just simulate the game against UCLA, simulate the game against Rutgers, and get to the one that we all really care about. I do think that is something. If you gave Ohio State fans the option entering Saturday I do think that most fans probably would hit that button and would get you to November 29th, because that's really the one that everyone is gearing up for, and everyone's excited about.
Yeah, I would agree. We have I mean, we've all got our own expectations in mind in terms of what this team is capable of. I think that especially as Indiana has kind of I don't want to say they kept it closer with Wisconsin than I think people anticipated this past weekend. I think it would be more appropriate to invoke the term struggle in terms of what happened against Penn State, given that they needed to wrestle that one away in the last minute of that game. But it was kind of viewed as Ohio State as Indiana as being separate from everybody else in college football to that point. It's certainly, especially in wake of the fact that Texas A&M needed a miraculous comeback to beat South Carolina this past weekend. It certainly seems like to this point in the season, Ohio State has separated themselves from the rest of the pack, but we haven't really gotten to see them truly test themselves against an elite opponent since the very first game of the season against Texas. And so I think we're all craving for not only to see them play somebody that is going to tell us and definitively demonstrate to everybody else what we already know in terms of how good this team is, but then also, obviously, there's wanting to see the first win over Michigan since before the pandemic. So we're all pretty much very much looking forward to that. And yeah, it would be nice if we could just sim through the Rutgers game, but don't ever overlook any opponent. Shiano's a guy that loves to pick fights with Ryan Day in a very literal sense. And you know that Rutgers is going to do everything they can to keep this one close. That being said, Ohio State is once again like 31.5 point favorites, and the line keeps getting bigger even though they might not play their two best receivers next week, and for all we know, could be the Lincoln Keenholz game, and they try to keep saying healthy going into Michigan. So, a lot remains to be seen. I would wait for the final injury report before you make any scoring predictions or any other forecasts for the game. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But we have that to look forward to, and we've got a whole host of more shows to look forward to this week. I imagine Kyle Jones's film study for this game will be a bit more optimistic than the one last week, but like we both alluded to on the show today, UCLA wasn't exactly going to be a stiff barometer in terms of assessing how much the run game has improved. But you can't really be that upset at a 48-10 win. So overall, I think good things coming out of this game and ahead, and we look forward to talking through those with you and then previewing the Rutgers game this coming week before we get to the game that we've all been looking forward to since last season and perhaps even many more years before that. So one show at a time. We'll be back with Jones tomorrow to tease this week's episode of Film Study that'll drop Thursday. But until then, thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast, and we'll see you tomorrow. Chase, thank you for joining me once again. Thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. And yeah, we'll talk to you tomorrow. Take care, folks.